The following program is classified PG. It contains mild violence. Channel 7 recommends parental guidance for young viewers.
50,000 years in the making. Our nation has been built on heroes and heart. Explorers, builders, and the brave. This country has been forged in war and peace, discovery and invention, adversity and triumph. This is Australia, the story of us. June 15, 1862, Eugowra, New South Wales. A wagon full of treasure. Unknowingly, it's on its way to an ambush. Heavily armed police guard 77 kilos of gold, heading from the diggings to the banks in Sydney. Australia is flooded with gold miners seeking their fortunes.
Down on the ground.
But not everyone
Open your mouths and you're dead.
wants to work for it. Frank Gardner,
Right one time.
horse thief, escaped convict, bushranger.
Get in your positions.
Gardner hijacks a wool cart and blocks the track. He's trying to pull off the biggest gold robbery Australia's ever seen. Gold fever has Australia in its grip, and we're producing 1/3 of the world's supply. Fortune hunters flood into Australia, the world's greatest population explosion, driven by gold. Over 40 years, from Ballarat to Kalgoorlie, 200 tons of gold is pulled from the earth. Today, that's worth $10 billion.
So you have this huge influx of immigrants coming to the goldfields to try their luck. And of course, very, very few people are successful. So there is great temptation if you know someone that's now making his way back to the city with a pocket full of gold. It's a very tempting target. And this is why we see this explosion of bushranging in the 1850s, 1860s, right up to the 1880s and the Kelly outbreak.
To take on the heavily defended stagecoach, Gardner has put together a gang. Harry Manns, Johnny Gilbert, Ben Hall. Men who are prepared to face the extreme hazards of bushranging.
I think the bushranger was so well loved
Keep still.
because our notion was that he only plundered those who could afford to lose it and who probably deserved it anyway. So there is that brash anti-authoritarianism in the bushranger myth.
Frank Gardner knew that the gold was well protected. In fact, there was a police sergeant with 2 troopers with rifles and pistols, so they had to plan carefully. What they did was they set a trap.
Whoa! Whoa! Stop! Whoa! What are you men doing? Get this dray gone!
Frank knows the punishment for bushranging is death. The gold on board the stagecoach would set him up for life.
Fire!
The police have more modern, powerful weapons. Frank and his gang rely on blind courage. When 2 police are hit, they run. Gardner and his gang are now Australia's most wanted. Frank Gardner's gold heist is front page news. He joins the ranks of Australia's bushranger celebrities, like Victoria's Captain Moonlight and Harry Power. WA's Moondine Joe, Queensland's Kenneth brothers, and most famous of all, Ned Kelly, whose last stand will be made into the world's first feature film.
There's a little of the bushranger in all of us Australians. And that's why perhaps we have a natural, some would say unseemly empathy for the likes of bushrangers.
A day's ride from the scene of the crime, the bushrangers hide out. Their loot would be worth more than $4 million today.
I expected gold, but not cash.
But the gang won't get to spend it all.
Frank, troopers! Quick, gather everything.
With troopers on their tail, the gang pockets the cash.
Chop, chop.
But they struggle to carry all the heavy gold. They will dump most of it. Legend has it that Frank Gardner's gold is still out there, somewhere, buried in the bush. Hall and Gilbert will make a lucrative career from bushranging. But within 3 years, both die in shootouts with police. Harry Manns gets caught. He's the only bushranger to hang for the Ugara job. But Frank Gardner does something few bushrangers do. He retires to Queensland. He'll be caught in 2 years, serve a decade in prison, and spend the rest of his days running a saloon in California.
Frank was probably the only bushranger that died in his bed in San Francisco sometime around 1902 at the ripe old age of 74. So Frank was indeed a very bright individual because he did, in the end, get away with it.
Fire!
Despite the gold rush and the enormous wealth it brings, the outside world of electronic communications stops on our doorstep. Coming up, John Stewart versus Burke and Wills in the race to connect Australia.
The moment you create electronic information with the twisting of 2 bits of wire together, the world has changed forever.
But scouting a path for the new overland telegraph line becomes a battle for survival. July 1862. The Northern Territory, 1,500 kilometres from Adelaide. And racing to become the first European to cross the continent and survive is John McDowell Stewart. Thirsty, exhausted, risking his life to forge a path for the telegraph wire that will connect Australia to the world. He's already tried and failed twice.
There's some incredible Australian explorers, but one of the most extraordinary was John McDowell Stewart, because he kept attempting to try and go from, in effect, the southernmost bit of Australia, Adelaide, to Darwin. He was the ultimate Aussie explorer as far as I'm concerned.
This is the age of exploration and communication. The world has the electric telegraph, a global network of cables for sending instant messages. But the wires stop just north of Australia.
Before the telegraph, if you want to get a message to London, you have to write it on a piece of paper. It has to be put on a ship and taken all the way to London. It takes months. And then it takes months for the reply to get back. But the moment you create electronic information with the twisting of 2 bits of wire together, the world has changed forever.
If the telegraph is to reach our new cities, it must span the continent, from north to south, over a merciless landscape that turns back or kills every white man who tries to cross it. In less than 2 years, 4 expeditions attempt to cross Australia. It's the amazing race of the 19th century. Only a few months earlier, Stuart's great rivals, Burke and Wills, make it from Melbourne to the Gulf of Carpentaria. Their expedition is lavishly funded and equipped, but on the way home, they die of sickness and hunger. John Stuart is 3 months out of Adelaide and still 1,800 kilometres from the Northern Sea. He's in the dead heart of the continent, on punishing terrain and in crippling heat. With every step, they're further away from safety.
When the Australian explorers and settlers journey inland, by and large they journey into drier and harsher country. Country that seems to say, you don't belong here. A country that wants to drive you back. And Stuart's great achievement is that he pushes into the zone which we could think of as the zone of silence and of death.
No rain seems to have fallen here for a length of time. We have not seen a bird, nor heard the chirrup of any to disturb the gloomy silence.
Stuart has explored Central Australia for more than 15 years. He's learnt to travel light and strictly ration dehydrated food. Their biggest enemy is thirst. To stay alive, they must constantly find new sources of water.
Come on, lads. On top. We'll keep moving north.
It's a task that doesn't fall to Stuart alone. He understands he's crossing harsh, remote, but not empty country. Since the British arrived in Australia more than 70 years ago, contact with Indigenous Australians often ends in bloodshed. But Stuart looks to the locals for help, especially about where to find water.
When white men went out and successfully found their way across vast tracts of country, you'll often find it was because they had really good relationships and knew how to interact with the Aboriginal people along the way.
Once Stuart finds a water source, he travels out and back, up to a dozen times, in search of the next creek or spring. Only then does he move on. It's an exhausting way to explore. After 5 months, they've travelled over 3,000 kilometres, but they're close to the limits of their endurance.
He was an extraordinary bushman, the most incredible perseverance, and he was able to motivate the fellow explorers that went with him.
But as Stuart and his men struggle north, they're at their limit. They're running out of food. The horses are sick. The water bags leak, and the mercury nudges 50 degrees. Yet Stuart continues to pit his toughness against the bush, the desert, and distance. And then...
Slut!
A sound they've heard before.
Lads! Lads! Lads, it's a sea! Go!
3,500 kilometres of desert. 6 months in the saddle, and Stuart gallops the beaches of the Timor Sea. He's the first European to cross Australia from Adelaide to what will become Darwin.
I have tried all my life to do this. and now have succeeded.
Stuart is a master map maker, and his charts will guide him and his men home. On the very same day as Burke and Will's funeral in Melbourne, John Stuart will ride the streets of Adelaide, triumphant.
The tyranny of distance. It's laid at the foundation of some of modern Australia's great successes. The telegraph line that Stuart surveyed across the continent was part of that enterprise of trying to conquer the tyranny of distance. I think it's a quintessential Australian characteristic, and it's one area where we excel.
An army of workers soon follows Stuart's path. They build the world's longest continuous overland telegraph line from Adelaide to the Timor Sea. It takes 2 years, 36,000 poles, 3,000 kilometres of wire stretched across the continent. Repeater stations will become the settlements of Alice Springs, Tennant Creek and Katherine. Now, events in London are news in Melbourne, not in months, but in hours.
What an impact it would have made on their lives. And then suddenly all this information was available quickly because transport services still weren't that fast then. You know, the world didn't move at a quick pace then. So the availability of instant information would have had a huge impact on people.
Australia is wired to the world, and with the flick of a switch, everything changes. Lightning-fast communication, the newly rich economy, and a shorter working day means now it's time to play. Coming up, is it crazy rugby, Irish soccer, or an ancient Aboriginal kicking game?
There's a million things that I love about a game that we proudly say is the greatest in the world.
How an on-the-spot call
Kick it over the top!
will come to define the sport, both in Australia and around the world. June 5, 1869, Richmond, Melbourne. The Melbourne Football Club clashes with Her Majesty's troops. The soldiers wear red sashes. The battle's been fought for almost 2 hours, and it's a dead heat. 0-0.
Pick it up! Kick the ball!
One of the founders of football in Australia,
What's wrong with you?
Tom Wills, famous cricketer, desperate for the win.
Use the space! Go!
Success against the British will help him promote Victorian rules football and lay the foundations of our greatest, uniquely Australian sport.
When you sit and watch a match and you see all the elements that I think make a great country, in many ways are played out on a football field.
Let's keep it up!
The clock's running down, and Tom Wills calls for tactics which require a skill that will come to define this sport.
Use the width of the field! Kick the ball! Kick it over the top!
The mark. "20 years earlier, Tom saw his first high mark. His neighbours, boys from the Jabwarang and Jadwajali people, play a game called Man Gruk. Indigenous Australians play different versions all over the continent.
It's awesome to know that Aussie rules might have derived from Mangrook, a traditional game that Aboriginal people used to play when they used to fill a possum skin up with charcoal and there'd be 50 on each side. And they'd kick it and hand pass it and throw it and mark it all day long, sometimes over 3 or 4 days.
What he sees will stay with Tom Wills for the rest of his life.
I think it's going to keep them on their feet as well.
12 years later, Wills is one of Australia's most famous sportsmen. He's captain of the Victorian cricket team.
We need to devise a game of our own, a game that supports grown men on harder ground.
The cricket players need a new sport in winter, a game they can play in the wet.
If we make the field bigger, we have 20 men on either side.
Wills went to school in England. He played rugby and soccer was everywhere. But Wills wants a new Australian game with the best action from each sport. And he remembers the moves he saw in Marngrook.
A handball style.
It's got a little bit of soccer, a little bit of Gaelic, a little bit of rugby, and you know, like I think that's why Aussies love it. It's a bit of a mongrel sport, a bit of a combo of everything, and that's how we are as Aussies.
We remove the crossbar and make 2 smaller posts either side. Maybe make the field an oval shape.
Yes, agreed.
They put their signatures to 10 key rules. At this moment, what will become Aussie rules footy is born. And the timing is perfect. The economy's booming, wages soar, and there's more time to play. In Melbourne, workers have locked in an 8-hour day, while British workers still do up to 16. Australia is known around the world as the working man's paradise. Before the good times, only rich people played sport. Now, it's for everyone.
They weren't the privileged darlings of society. They were ordinary working men. Therefore, they couldn't lose their wages by having to take time off from a violent and vigorous game of footy. So it had to have rules.
Before the rule book, games were an excuse for a punch-up. 40 players aside, no refs, no boundaries. The brawling might go on for days. But even when it gets organised, the first proper footy games are still rough. On this winter day back in 1869, Tom Wills looks to his cousin and team captain, Henry Harrison. He's one of Melbourne's best and toughest.
Football is essentially a rough game all the world over, and it is not suitable for men poodles and milksops.
It's still 0-0. The Aussies finally see their chance.
Go! Go!
The Victorians beat the British soldiers 1-0. Their pride in their team and their game will echo around Australia.
Got the bastards in the end.
I played AFL. I'm proud of the sport. I'm proud of what it taught me before I got into the world of golf. So at the end of the day, we actually embraced it because it was ours. Australian football is Australian football.
The game grows and spreads through the southern and western colonies. In a decade, the Victorian Football League kicks off. Every generation produces its own football heroes. In 1990, VFL becomes a national code and an Australian obsession.
And then off the step to fall forward. Big fly, Bird, Goods, could he roll it through? He can!
The biggest thing I love about football is the opportunities to play something that's so fun and inclusive. So many different shapes and sizes of people can play this game. It doesn't discriminate against where you come from, what team you follow, what religion you follow.
Every year, our game inspires more than 7 million footy fans to barrack for their teams around Australia.
As a nation, we can say that this is our game. I think it's the most exciting game in the world to watch. There's a haphazardness about it It's high scoring, it's combative, there's a million things that I love about it. A game that we proudly say is the greatest in the world.
In the 1880s, Australia enters its third decade of boom time. Australian cities explode. As well as sport, we embrace art and entertainment, but many regard Australia as a cultural backwater. Coming up,
what is your name? My name is Nellie.
How a struggling Melbourne mother becomes the greatest singer the world has ever seen.
She's the person who does it first. She's paved the way for so many other women.
A woman who defies the odds, and how it almost never happened for Dame Nellie Melba. Paris, 1886. Nellie Armstrong. Melbourne housewife, struggling mother. She's gambled everything for the audition of a lifetime. Australia is famous for sheep and gold, but it's considered a cultural desert. If she's successful today, she'll put herself and her country on the world stage.
Madame est occupée. Vous pouvez essayer de revenir demain.
S'il vous plaît, est-ce que je peux attendre?
Nellie wants to make it in opera. It's the pop music of the day.
I've been through an audition process myself, and that was nerve-wracking, let alone having to get a ship all the way to France. I mean, all that time to get nervous, only to get there and think, oh, I hope I don't blow this.
What is your name? My name is Nellie. Nellie Armstrong. Where are you from? Melbourne, Australia.
Madame Marchesi. Her students become household names. But she only takes on the very best. Nellie has prepared an aria from Verdi's La Traviata. It takes a great voice to pull it off.
For a moment I was tongue-tied. Then I thought to myself, this is your last chance.
Nellie just would have thought, she hates me. She hates me.
Melbourne, 4 years earlier. Nellie makes a name for herself as an amateur. No recorded music, no radio or TV. Australians create their own entertainment.
If you think about the way in which everyone in Australia today would want to have a widescreen television, anyone of any kind of income at all in Australia in the 19th century would have a piano. The classic night's entertainment would be to get the sheet music of the latest popular song and play it. And you'd all sing along. But that's what people did to have a great night.
The wife of the Austro-Hungarian consul once sang opera in Europe. She gives Nellie a letter of introduction to the best singing teachers in Paris, the opera capital of the world. Getting to Paris seems impossible, but it's not the only barrier in Nellie's path. Her husband, Charlie Armstrong. He forbids any talk of a singing career. What Charlie wants is a share of the small allowance Nellie's father provides for her.
It's not fair of you to ask me.
Nellie stands up to her husband.
Why won't you help us? I am trying to make this work!
Hands off me!
and suffers the consequences.
The fact in the 1800s that women weren't allowed to forge a career, and Melly rejected those conservative rules and regulations and decided to stand up for herself is extremely powerful and pioneering, and shows a true sense of tenacity and self-belief.
Nellie Melba was both a woman of her time and a woman well beyond it, because this was an age where women's rights were starting to be proclaimed and advocated and fought for in Australia and indeed around the world.
Eventually, Nellie persuades her husband to come with her to Europe, but only after Nellie's father promises to pay their fares. For Nellie, everything depends on this audition. But it seems like her professional career is over before it's begun.
Mademoiselle, could you sing the last stanza of the song? S'il vous plaît. Ça va, c'est très bien.
Please, madame, say something.
We are going to work together very well. Bravo, bravo.
For Nellie to be thrown into an emotional turmoil whereby she thinks she's been abandoned and the whole trip has been a failure, and then to perform to perfection again, shows an incredible amount of control. It said a lot about Nellie herself. She was incredibly strong.
Eventually, Nellie Armstrong divorces her husband and changes her last name to Melba, after her home city. Her career coincides with the invention of the gramophone. She's one of the first global recording stars. Nellie earns more than any other artist and always handles her own finances. King George V makes her a Dame Commander of the British Empire. She becomes the most famous Australian in the world.
She was a wonder all over the world, greeted with Melba mania wherever she went. And Australians felt not that she was their darling, but that she was indeed a leader.
The thing about Dame Nellie Melba is not just that she was smart, interesting, a businesswoman, courageous, travelled, all of those things, but it's to be the person who does it first. She's paved the way for so many other women.
Nellie's rise from the suburbs of Melbourne to the boulevards of Paris has been meteoric. But for Australians back home, after 4 decades of prosperity, the working man's paradise is about to come crashing down. Coming up,
open the gates.
It's the GFC of 1890. Workers and bosses go head to head.
We really believe in the fair go.
Pushed to the brink of civil war on the road to federation.
Union scum!
But in the battle for wealth for toil, who will get a fair share of Australia's riches? September 19, 1890, near Circular Quay, Sydney. After 4 decades of boom, Australia is dragged into a global financial crisis. Employers lay off thousands. Striking maritime workers picket ports around Australia, and the working man's paradise is under threat.
Come on, put your back into it. Higher. Over, that's it.
Wool auctioneer George Maiden son of a convict, desperate to get his clients' wool bales on the ship to London
And you go check around the back.
and keep his company afloat.
Check the side. I want the side all secure.
The striking workers are determined to stop him from reaching the docks. It's the start of a conflict that will decide who gets a fair share of Australia's wealth for the next 120 years. Less than a century after the British came to stay, Australia has grown rich on gold and wool. By the 1880s, white working men are the highest paid in the world.
We were a rich country, there was a building boom, there was plenty of activity going on, and Australian workers realised they had muscle and clout.
Now, in 1890, the global economic crisis destroys profits and jobs. Hard times spark a 10-year war that will threaten to tear Australia apart.
In the 1890s, there is this appalling crash. The banks collapse, businesses go under. And really it's brought about by the conditions that we're familiar with more recent crashes, and that is that there was rampant speculation on companies that actually weren't producing anything. And, well, greed, basically.
Union scum!
As world markets crash, the maritime strike paralyses trade and polarises Australia.
Down the back. I want you to check the back corner down there.
The mob grows in number and fury. Maiden's client is wool baron William Halliday. He owns 200,000 sheep.
Let's get this wool to London. Run them down.
He's not inclined to share his fortune. The wool ship to London sails in a few hours. Maiden must go now.
Open the gates.
But the workers aren't going down without a fight. In an era before the dole, Medicare, pensions or government schools, workers' jobs are all they've got. Labourer Frederick Townsend is unemployed and angry.
This isn't bloody London! Nor is it the bloody bush!
He wants the chance to earn enough for his family to live decently. What will become known as a fair go.
People got to a point where they just couldn't take any more. And being Australians, it's that battler thing where, well, it can only be pushed so far, but we're too fair. We're not going to be downtrodden. Eventually we're going to kick up and say, no, this is not right.
Townsend makes a stand for what he thinks is right. Still a mile from the harbour, the workers seem to have won. But Maiden's father came to Australia in chains. He's determined to continue his family's rise. As workers will all over Australia, Townsend sees violence as the only way to drive his point home. Over the next decade, industrial warfare erupts across the colonies. In the Queensland shearers' strikes, workers torch wool sheds and fight pitched gun battles with police.
These great strikes of the early 1890s bring us to the brink of civil war. You've got workers and bosses willing to go to physical conflict in order to resolve their problems.
Maiden drives on despite his wound. The cops arrest 15, including Frederick Townsend. He gets 6 months. Today, George Maiden will get his client's wool to the ship and the markets in England. But the violence of the 1890s appalls Australia. We create some of the first laws and courts in the world that force bosses and workers to resolve disputes peacefully and fairly. They are the foundation of Australians' employment conditions for more than 100 years.
We really believe in the fair go. I think that's what marks us out amongst so many other nations.
Faith in the fair go is one of the things that unites Australians. In 1901, the colonies federate. Australia, the nation, is born. In many ways, ours is the fairest country on earth. But not for everyone. Australia excludes Asian migrants and refuses to recognise Indigenous Australians. Yet within just 2 years, Australia is the first nation to allow women not just to vote, but to stand for Parliament. A new country, a new century, and soon a war that will change us forever.
They're the Anzac stories of success you've never heard. Off the coast of Gallipoli, the Aussie submarine that snuck in and took on the enemy fleet. The roo shooter from Queensland who hunted down the enemy's best sniper. And the Aussie soldiers who defeated the Germans. The French town that promises to never forget Australia. The stories of success and bravery you've never heard. A special Story of Us. Next Sunday.